Hey guys, Michael Pekka here, and I will be going over the yellow fever virus. So what are some characteristics of the yellow fever virus? Well, it is part of the family Flaviviridae, which comes from the Latin root of flavus, which means yellow, and that comes from the very distinctive symptoms that yellow fever virus produces. So yellow eyes, jaundice, which is like a yellow skin. It's very distinct, and so people just start calling it yellow fever virus. So pretty straightforward. It is part of the genus of flavivirus, and so some characteristics of this genus are that they tend to be positive single-stranded RNA, transmitted by arthropods, typically mosquitoes and ticks, and they are enveloped. And yellow fever virus is actually related to several other rather potent viruses such as dengue virus, West Nile virus, and Japanese encephalitis. So a pretty nasty family all around. And so here's even some more specifics. This is a yellow fever virus structure, and its nucleic acid is positive single-stranded RNA. The envelope is icosahedral, which is just a more specific designation as to like what the structure is, and you can see right on the right. And the size tends to be 50 to 60 nanometers, which is pretty typical for this genus. Now the nucleic acid, we'll get a little bit more into viral replication, but basically what this entails is that positive ssRNA just goes 5' to 3', and that's pretty much it. The range. Now once again, I mentioned before that these viruses tend to be transmitted by arthropods, and yellow fever virus is transmitted generally by mosquitoes. And mosquitoes just absolutely thrive in tropical and subtropical areas. So Central Africa, South America tend to be just hot spots for yellow virus. We don't really see it up in colder areas because mosquitoes don't live there. And we'll get a little bit later into transmission, but in fact, yellow fever virus is only transmittable through mosquitoes, and it does not pass from person to person, which is quite interesting. So here we can see some of the regions, and these are maps from the CDC, which recommend areas that you should be vaccinated. So if you ever visit these areas, make sure you get vaccinated for yellow fever. So the history. Now, yellow fever virus has been around for millennia. It's a pretty old virus, but it wasn't until relatively recently that we began to understand more like how it works, and it became more of common knowledge. And so it originated in Africa. Scientists believe that it came about due to primates and mosquitoes intermingling with local populations of people. And so it's quite fascinating, but over time the local populations in Africa developed an immunity to the yellow fever virus. So when the scramble for Africa and slave trade occurred, a lot of the times European colonists living with the local population, if there was an outbreak of yellow fever virus, the population of Europeans would just be absolutely decimated, and the locals, they would fare much better. Obviously there would be some deaths, but they'd fare much, much better, and that was due to the immunity they had. So of course, if you're a slave and you're infected and you get transported to the Caribbean, which is, surprise, another very tropical area where mosquitoes can thrive, if you're infected with that, you can transmit that disease to other people, and that's exactly what happened. The first recorded outbreak was in the Yucatan Peninsula in 1648, which scientists believe was part of a much wider outbreak in Cuba. And throughout the New World and even in Europe, there were just massive outbreaks in the 18th and 19th centuries due to the fact that a lot of the times people just didn't have that immune response, and mosquitoes were just so prevalent. So Dr. Carlos Finlay was a Cuban epidemiologist, and he was the first one to discover that mosquitoes transmit yellow fever virus and not people. And so what he did, and it's pretty questionable ethically, was he basically had an infected mosquito inject a person, and over time they developed yellow fever virus. This wasn't confirmed until the Yellow Fever Commission, which was a commission set up by the U.S. military following the Cuban-American War, which had huge amounts of people die from yellow fever. And they confirmed what Dr. Carlos Finlay first discovered. What they did was they infected 30 people with infected mosquitoes, and surprise, they got yellow fever virus. It's actually the first human virus discovered. We've knew about plant viruses in the past, but this was the first human virus, which is very cool. And knowing that the mosquito is what transmits the yellow fever virus, the Panama Canal project was actually saved. So when a lot of American workers would head down to Panama to build this canal, they didn't have immunity. They would get sick, and many of them would die, like huge numbers. Like I believe like around 85% of the workers were infected at one point. So what happened was once they discovered mosquitoes were the reasons, they actually set up a mosquito brigade, which consisted of about 4,000 men, and they'd go around and they would destroy mosquito breeding grounds to reduce mosquito populations, and it worked. And the workers stopped getting sick. DDT, which is a pesticide, was used pretty abundantly, especially in the early 20th century, to target mosquito populations. And in the late 30s, throughout the 40s, the yellow fever vaccine became quite popular and widespread. And it is a very effective vaccine. Only a single shot is needed to develop a lifelong immunity. And in the modern world, there are limited outbreaks in Africa, which tends to suffer from lower vaccination rates, as well as poor infrastructure, dense urban populations. Tends to be more tropical, especially in Central Africa. So it's just the perfect storm for yellow fever. So what are some hallmarks of the disease? So in terms of transmission, the yellow fever virus is only transmitted by female vaccines, typically of the Aedes aegypti species. There are a few others, but this tends to be the main one. And what happens is the virus just replicates within the mosquito, and once it reaches a threshold level, it can be passed through the saliva of the mosquito. So when it bites you, if it's an infected mosquito and it bites you, it's going to inject that virus into your bloodstream. The thing is, once you're infected by it, and no matter at what stage you are in the infection, you cannot transmit this to other humans, which is very interesting. And people didn't really seem to understand this a lot in the beginning, but over time, as we developed proper science, this was discovered. The R naught varies. One report I saw had a moderate calculation of around 4, but it seems very difficult to calculate, no doubt due to the fact that a lot of the times this virus exists in areas with poor infrastructure, so it tends to be hard to get accurate statistics. But I saw an R naught as high as 90, which seems a bit implausible, and as low as like 0.2, which also seems implausible. But 4 seems to be a relatively reasonable number. This is from an 18th century historian during an outbreak, talking about how people originally believed that it was transmitted through human contact. So friends avoided each other in the streets and only signified their regard by a cold nod. The old custom of shaking hands fell into such disuse that many were affronted at even the offer of the hand. Fortunately, over time, we realized that humans can't pass it. It is rather mosquitoes. So there are 3 transmission cycles. The first was jungle cycle, which is usually if an infected primate has the disease, a mosquito will come by, drink the blood, be infected, and that infected mosquito will pass that virus on to humans. Then you have a savanna cycle, which is where perhaps a human doesn't go into a jungle but is near a jungle. Well, an infected primate can pass that virus to a mosquito, and that mosquito can pass it to the human. Then you have an urban cycle, where mosquitoes living in urban areas can pass that disease between infected humans and non-infected humans. And these aren't just separate, distinct cycles. They can interact with each other. So, for instance, perhaps a human goes into a jungle, gets infected from a mosquito, goes back into the city, and while in the city, a mosquito comes, drinks his blood, and passes it on to other people. So that would be an example of a jungle and urban cycle kind of working together. As for viral replication, the target cells for the yellow fever virus is the dendritic cells. and they have certain cell receptors that allows them to target these cells. Interesting structure, but the mRNA actually lacks a 3' terminal end and instead has these loops which protect degradation in the cytoplasm. And it's very simple. It only codes for 10 proteins, but it uses these proteins very well. And some are involved with the structure and some are not. The site of replication assembly is the endoplasmic reticulum. And once those viruses get assembled, they get sent out to the membrane where they bud, and then they can go and infect other cells that are nearby. So the infection timeline, it operates pretty quickly within about 3 weeks. So day 0, you're infected. You are going to have no symptoms for about 3 to 6 days, and then there's going to be a rapid onset of symptoms. And these tend to be relatively minor: fever, headache, nausea, vomiting. That's pretty much about it. It doesn't sound very pleasant, but most people recover after this point. For some people, there's a period of false remission. So for about 24 hours, symptoms lessen. They seem to be on the up and up. And then the period of intoxication happens. Major symptoms appear. You have heavy fever, kidney failure, there's hemorrhaging, and this lasts for about 7 days, at which point, if you don't get better, you will die. And about 20 to 50% of people die from this virus once they reach this point, which is pretty high, pretty scary stuff. So this is the complete timeline. You have an infection and incubation until about from days 3 to 6. Then you have the symptoms appear for about 3 days, recovery or remission, intoxication, and perhaps death. So symptoms. So here we have this image which shows someone with yellow eyes, and it is a very distinct look. Like, you can easily tell why they called it the yellow fever virus. It is a very distinct look. Initial symptoms. Once again, sun, fever, chills, headache, fatigue, weakness. And most people display no symptoms. And most recover after 1 week. Now, if they don't recover, they may develop more severe symptoms, such as high fever, yellow skin, bleeding, shock, and organ failure. And once you reach this point, there's a really high likelihood that you will die. So every year, there are about 200,000 infections, about 30,000 deaths. And once you reach severe symptoms, about 20 to 50% of people die. So treatment. There is no treatment, unfortunately. There is no medicine. The CDC recommends that just get lots of fluids, lots of rest. And if you go to an area that has a high amount of cases, if you notice yourself developing symptoms, stay inside. And the reason being is they don't want mosquitoes to pick up that virus, which can be transmitted to other people. Now, the vaccine, as I mentioned beforehand, is very effective. A single shot will give you about lifetime immunity. Fortunately, with the decline in mosquito populations, the increase in vaccine rates, this virus is on the decline, but there are, of course, outbreaks that we always need to watch out for. Overall, this is a very fascinating virus, a very interesting history, major impact on epidemiology, and I hope you guys enjoyed this talk, and that's it. So thank you.